Hello and welcome to this first tutorial for my Stitchquilt series. My Stitchquilt series is a series of currently free anyway, small charts designed to be stitched and made up into these little quilt as you go hexagons. So this is a tutorial for taking your stitched piece, and I've got mine here, stitched on a 5-inch square approximately piece of fabric, and making it up into one of these quilt as you go hexagons. So this is just the basic standard finish for all your Stitchquilt pieces. At a later point, I'll talk about how you can take these hexagons and make them into a whole range of other things. But today we're just talking about how you go from this to one of these lovely hexagon pieces. So you will need your stitched piece, obviously. You will need ruler, pencil, scissors, ordinary paper scissors. You will also need, and I'm now wondering where I've put mine, some fabric scissors. I may have to pause and find them. Right here. These are embroidery scissors, but they will do for cutting fabric. In an ideal world, you would have proper fabric scissors. You can even use, you know, ruler and rotary cutter if you're that sort of person. I sometimes am, but not for this tiny project. Okay, you will need your backing fabric and binding fabric. That's all one thing. I'm slightly deciding as we go. I think I'm going to go with this yellow one rather than the blue one. So again, 5-inch square of quilting cotton. This, if you're interested, is one from Tilda's Creating Memories series. I really like these sort of low volume. A lot of mine, in fact, you can see all of the ones I've done so far, I've finished in a chambray fabric, which is pretty much a solid. And that gives a nice sort of coherent look. But this is going to be a standalone one. I know what I'm going to do with this, and I'm not going to stitch it to a whole lot of others. So I am using this one with a little bit of a pattern on it. Obviously, it's up to you. You can do all of yours with patterns. You can do them however you like, really. But that's what I'm going to use for that. So I've got my stitched piece. I've got my backing and binding fabric. I have got my 2-inch piece of hexiform. And that's what I'm using. That's what I've used in all of these so far. Just to give a little bit of a heft, I suppose, to it. A little bit of softness. They're still obviously very flexible. But just a bit more than just 2 pieces of fabric together. It also gives you a little bit of a cushion for your stitching, and I think they make a really nice finish. So I think you'll want something. It's fine if you don't have these pre-cut hexiforms. I'll talk about that in a moment, but you'll want maybe a piece of quite thin felt would work, some stiffer interfacing. I probably wouldn't use iron-on interfacing for this, but I guess you could. But you probably want it a little bit thicker than that. Fusible fleece is a nice thing that would probably work really well for this. Quilt batting, but a nice low loft quilt batting. I don't think you want a big thick, that tend to be the sort of synthetic ones, tend to be a bit thicker. I think you probably don't want that. But a low loft batting, something that's going to give a little bit of, yeah, feel, heft. Heft feels like the right word to this. And you will need some sewing thread, ordinary sewing thread, and a needle for that. You'll want some pins, ideally pins and wonder clips. This is a lovely little bag that Sew Me Sarah gave me at Stitch in London retreat a couple of years ago, and I use it to keep my wonder clips in. You can do it with just ordinary pins, but I do find the wonder clips really help. And then you'll want your Stitchquilt information page. This is freely available to download via the link on my Instagram or on my Facebook group. I am Ros Clark Craft everywhere. And we're going to start by cutting this out. Now let me explain what we're going to do. I'm going to start just by cutting off this half of the page. Okay, so I'm keeping the half that has all my list of things I need and the fabrics and the colours of threads and all the rest of it, putting that to one side. Okay, and then I'm going to cut very loosely around my hexagon. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to cut out the hexagon so that that is one nice beautiful piece, but I also want to leave the outside relatively intact so we can use that as a kind of well, I'll show you what we'll use it for in a minute. But so I am cutting in, obviously, and then I'm cutting quite carefully along these lines. When you print the information page, you need to make sure that your printer is set to 100%. That is particularly true if you're somewhere where you're using a letter size. Your printer defaults to letter size rather than A4. Because not only might it shrink it slightly, in which case you'll end up with slightly smaller or bigger hexagon, which is probably not the end of the world, so long as you always use the same one. But if you're on letter page, it will change the ratio of the height to the width of the paper slightly, and so it will actually squash your hexagon, and the sides will not all be the same length. So it's my hexagon. You just want to measure that, make sure, I've already measured mine, that that has come out 2 inches along each of the sides. I'm going to put that to one side, and I'm going to grab a little bit of washi tape or sellotape or whatever you've got. That's electrical tape, I probably won't use that. Here we go, a little bit of washi tape, just to hold that all in place. It's not, you know, the end of the world, but it is just easier if that's all held together along that cut line. I'll do it at the back as well. And then what we're going to use this for is to center our hexagon on our stitching, because it's quite difficult if you take a sort of solid hexagon and I put it here and I'm like, well, it definitely covers it all, but it also covers it all if I put it here or if I put it here. And what I want to make sure, obviously, is that my stitching is in the middle. So if I take this, and they're always designed so you've got a straight edge top and bottom, and you want to line that with the grain of your fabric, then I can see, yeah, I think that looks right. Let's try it. Oh, no. Yeah. No. Yeah. That's about where I want my finished piece to be. And obviously there will be a border always around the edges, and that's where your binding fabric is going to show. Okay, so I'm going to hold that in place, and I'm just going to go in with my pencil and trace inside. This will never ever be visible. You might not want to use a pencil, you might prefer to use like a friction pen or tailor's chalk or whatever, but honestly it will all be covered, so you don't need to worry too much. So do keep this. I think it's a really useful tool to have that cut out. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out my fabric around that. I'm just going to check that it fits exactly, and in fact what I'm going to do, this is where I like to use pins. So I'm going to pin my hexiform onto here. Now obviously if the first thing you're doing is cutting out your lining, do that first, and make sure you cut it out really precisely, because that is going to determine the finished shape of your piece. So you'll use that and cut around that. I'm now going to cut around this on my fabric. Okay, so you don't need to leave any seam allowance, any border on this. You're cutting precisely to the edge of your hexagon. So you can see, actually, I've said 5-inch square pieces. What they really need to be is big enough to fit the hexagon on. So if it's slightly smaller than 5 inches, worth getting out your hexagon template, trying it on your fabric, and just seeing. You may well be able to get away with a piece that you thought was slightly too small to do that. Okay. I feel like the light's getting worse and worse as we go. Oh dear. I'll see what I can do, if there's anything I can do in what we laughingly call post-production that maybe makes it a little bit brighter. Okay, so this is now actual rubbish. Please don't keep these scraps. I am not responsible for that. Okay, so I have now got this hexagon here. Oh, I've not quite lined it up, but anyway, it will all be covered. It's exactly the size of my hexiform because I've cut those to match. And now what I want to do is cut out my piece from my backing fabric. And again, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my Hexiform, because this for me is the pre-cut. This is the you know, absolute gold standard. I think it's the same on both sides. And we're going to line it. I think I want to do it this way on here. Okay, and again, I'm just going to pin that to the Hexiform. And I'm just going to measure around the Hexiform, because what you want, in order to give you an even border, mine are not all completely even, in order to give you an even border, you want the same amount of fabric around each side of the hexagon. So we're going to measure, and if you're just using a 5-inch square, you won't be able to get an inch all the way around, and that's fine. I seem to have a ruler that's only got centimetres on it. You probably want to aim for 1/2 inch. If you've got more and you like a wider border, you can do that. But you want to aim for 1/2 inch. I'm actually going to, because my ruler's in centimetres, I'm going to aim for 1.5 centimetres. And again, I'm just going to draw that on, because we're just going to cut out along that line. Okay, make sure you've got it parallel to your edge. Okay. And with this, the precise measurement is less important than that you do it the same all the way around, frankly. And if you're doing a whole lot of these, you want to make sure you do them all the same, so that you've got the same width border on every piece, and that will look neater and smarter. So just keep going. You can see I'm just doing a sort of couple of marks in each direction on all 6 sides. Oh, did I do that wrong? No, I just haven't got that. There we go. And then I'm going to join these up with my ruler to cut the whole thing. Now you may find, and I will find here, when I join these lines up, just make sure you can see this, I'm going to join these lines up here and here. They would actually meet out here somewhere, and I've not got enough fabric there. That is fine. At your corners you have excess fabric, so you don't need to worry that, oh, I haven't quite got the full corner going out. It's the kind of thing that if you were doing it, you actually might well choose to cut off some of the excess at the corners anyway. So you will have plenty. If you're starting with a 5-inch square, I promise you will have plenty. Okay, so that's my hexagon. And it fits on a 5-inch square. You can see, if you had a 4.5-inch piece, you would not fit that on. You would have to have much narrower boundaries. So you do really need 5 inches of this. But yeah, like I say, if you're stitching fabric, you can get away with a bit less. Anyway, so we're going to cut along there. This is less important that it's perfectly perfect, because we're going to fold it in underneath. But you know, you want to do your best. Precision is not my forte. Unfortunately, this method has a lot of precision sort of built into it that even I can't completely fail at. And then at the point where you're stitching things together, there is a little bit of leeway. So you'll be fine. If I can do this, I promise you, you can do this. Okay, I'll just snip all the way. These are not my proper fabric scissors, but they're fine. Okay, and so then, again, don't keep that. Not responsible for you if you keep that. This is a stash busting project, not a stash enhancing project. So here we go. I'm going to layer these up. So remember, my fabric is double-sided, but you'll want the right side on the bottom. Then I want my Hexiform. Okay, and I want to center that. You can measure that if you want to be absolutely certain, but I think that looks all right to me. And then I want my stitch fabric on top. And again, I would put a couple of pins in here. The other thing you could do at this stage, if you've got it, is a little dab of sewing glue to hold your layers in place, but pins are fine at this point. But for the next step, I am going to use my Wonder Clips. And like I say, you can pin this, but I find these work really well. So what we're going to do is we're going to fold the edge of our fabric, and I do like to start either at the top or the bottom rather than one of the diagonals, and I'm just using my fingers, pressing that down nice and firmly. You could iron it, but you don't really need to at this point. And then I'm folding it again and making sure to fold it up to the edge of the hexagon. So that's my edge of my piece, and I'm going to put in a wonder clip to hold that in place. And we're going to go around and do the same on all 6 sides. So fold it down to the edge of your piece, give it a press, fold it over. Make sure your corner is tucked in nicely. And then what I'm actually going to do is move this wonder clip along and clip the corners. I like to end up with it just clipped at the corners because those are the bits that you really want to make sure are held in place as we go around. And here you see there wasn't enough corner fabric, but by the time I folded this over and I'm going to fold this in here, there's loads. So you're not worrying about that. So fold it down to the edge of the hexagon, give it a finger press, fold it in, making sure to fold it against the line to give you your hexagon. Wonder clip at the corner. Okay, keep going round. I'm going to push that in a bit further away from the edge. Over, press, fold, clip at the corner. Don't worry about that, that'll be easy to sort out as you're stitching it down. Okay, fold, fold, clip. Okay, try and make sure you're pushing your folded fabric right into the corners. Give you a neat corner. I'm coming round. So nearly there. This is my last one to fold in. And I like, you do not have to do this, I like to have all my folds kind of going the same way around instead of having one side where both are folding in the same direction. I'll show you what I mean when I get to the corner. So I'm folding that down and pressing that in. Now you can see, hopefully you can see, this side is folded over that side. I want this side to fold under that side. Okay, this is under here at this corner, so I want it to be over at this corner. So I'm just going to unfold this whole corner, fold this one down first, and then this one to come over the top. Honestly, if you don't do that, I promise you no one will notice, but I like to do that. Okay, and then I've got it all clipped down with my wonder clips at all 6 corners. At this point I'm going to get rid of the pins just because they get in the way when you're sewing. So all we have to do now is stitch down the inside of that. Sewing thread is what you'd normally use for this. If you're super lazy like me and it's also pouring with rain and your sewing thread that was inside the house has run out and you don't want to go out in the rain to get sewing thread from your sewing room in the garden, you can just use one strand of embroidery floss and it'll be fine. But you know, sewing thread is what I'd recommend really. It's a little bit finer than this. And our aim is to not see the thread at all. So you want to pick something that's going to blend in. I would recommend not a bright white. You could aim for something that matches the backing fabric or the binding fabric. But anything that's sort of beigey grey will generally blend in with more or less anything. So thread my needle. That's not a sewing needle. Let me get an actual sewing needle. That's a cross stitch needle. Let's find a sharp. You don't want, I would recommend for this, a very long needle because it's not a big piece. You want something that, you know, isn't getting in the way. But don't worry too much, you know, anything you've got that's got a point on it will be fine. Okay. Now, I'm going to do something which I rarely do. I am going to tie a knot in this to start it, as part of my, I don't want anyone to see this stitching at all attempt. Right. Okay, so I've threaded my needle. I'm going to tie a couple of knots in there because I really don't want it to go through. Because we're putting it through the linen, you know, there are holes in the linen. So I just want to give it enough of a knot that it's going to stay on the surface. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to start my stitching in the middle of a side rather than a corner. So I'm going to come in like an inch or so away from the side, and I'm stitching between my stitch piece and the backing fabric, sort of into the hexiform, but the main thing is I am not stitching it. Shouldn't be able to see anything, feel anything at the back. And I'm coming out just into the fabric. And when I pull it, I'm leaving the knot there with the end there, okay? And then my stitch, don't do a whip stitch. Please don't do a whip stitch. You can do a better stitch than that. I'm going directly opposite there into the linen, and I'm doing almost all of my stitch. My needle is underneath the fabric, and then I'm coming up, what's that? 1/4 of an inch or so, maybe less, further along. Little tiny stitch into the linen, under the fabric, and just come out at the end. So there's hardly any thread showing at all. That is your goal. Okay, and we're just going to keep going with that all the way around. Charlie, don't knock my light over, that won't be helpful. Okay, and I'm getting to the corner, just taking off my wonder clip there and making sure everything is properly tucked in place. Okay, and what we want ideally is the edge of that to line up so that the sort of corner is right on the edge. I've got a couple more stitches I'm going to do here. I'm quite liking how this is looking with the striped binding. Obviously it's different on the different angles, it's quite fun. And when I get to the corner, I want to make sure my net stitch is going to come up into the corner. And I'm going to put a stitch right there, making sure it goes through my linen and through all of those layers of fabric, and that will keep the fold down. You could go in and do another stitch along that line there, and sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. They're small enough that it will stay in place without, but if you prefer everything properly stitched down, you just pop a little stitch in there, your needle underneath, and come back out ready to do the next stitch there. Okay, and we're going to do that all the way around. I'll show you one more side and corner, and then I'm going to turn you off while I finish the stitching. Okay, this is all you then have to do, and you have a fully finished object. You can do this kind of finish for any size or shape, so long as it doesn't have sort of internal angles. You want all the angles sort of pointing outwards. You can do it with a curved piece, but I would say do it with some straight edge pieces first so that you get the hang of it. With a curved piece it's a little bit trickier, and you wouldn't want to do it if it's a really sharp curve, but if you've got a nice gentle sort of curve, you can make it work and make the fabric lie flat, and you'll want to make sure you press it really well at the end. Because mostly the fabric you're dealing with is on the bias rather than the grain. The fabric has some inbuilt flex. Okay, so I'm back at the corner, and you can see I put my needle right through at that point of the corner. I'm going to take another little stitch there, and then this time I'm just going to go straight on. Okay, so I'm going to pause you for a bit and keep going. Okay, so I've stitched all the way around. I've got all my 6 corners stitched down, and I'm just about to come back to where I started my thread. So I'm just going to show you how I would finish this off. So I think that's the last stitch that I need to do is there. I'm going to stitch that, and I'm going to put in a little locking stitch. That is, I'm going to put my thread through that loop and stitch it down again. And then I'm going to do like I did at the beginning. I'm going to run my needle through between the stitching and the hexiform, not going through to the back. You can see there's not a single stitch. Oh, there's one that's very slightly showing. No, I don't think there is. There shouldn't be any stitches showing through on your backing. Okay, you're aiming for all your stitching to be done between the linen and the binding. And then I'll pull it through here. I don't need to do a knot there, I don't mind doing a knot. And then I'm just going to snip these off, and I'm just going to pull the thread very slightly, push down on the fabric with my scissors and snip. And then the end, and I'll do that with the end I started with as well, pull the thread up, push the fabric down, snip, and it will just disappear. And that's your finished piece. I'm really chuffed with that, actually. I really like how this striping has worked out with a different look on each of the edges. Looks nice on the back. Obviously, you know, if you're doing a stripe like this, you want to make sure you've got it lying perpendicular upwards like that. I think that's centered reasonably well. Something you can do, which I think would look super cute on this one. This one was stitched, I think, on a 40 count. So there's more blank space around the edge. If you'd stitch this particularly on a 32 count, and even on a 36 count, you would not have a lot of space here. But would look nice to go around maybe with this colour thread that I've used for the little trail of the bees, and do like a hand quilting running stitch inside that border. We've not done any actual quilting on this. There are no stitches that go all the way through all 3 layers, and you don't need that with this technique, because essentially the seams where you were joining the pieces, if you were making this into a bigger thing, that acts as your quilting. But you can do a decorative stitch there, and I think that could look quite sweet on this. So that's how you make your basic quilt as you go hexagon for your Stitchquilt project. Next time I'll show you how you change this just very slightly to make it into an ornament. Obviously you could just stick a hanger on this and call it an ornament, but it's quite light, and I think we can do something a little bit better to make this an ornament. So I hope that was helpful. Please do, if you're at all unsure about what you're doing with this, go and watch Emma at Vintage Sewing Books. I will put a link below to her playlist, but also specifically to her tutorial for doing these quilt as you go hexagons. Much more detailed than mine, way better lighting than mine. She knows what she's talking about. So if you're at all unsure, go and check that out. But obviously feel free to ask as well. This could probably do with a little bit of an iron at this point, but otherwise I'm pretty pleased with that. Happy stitching!